Okay, so what we are talking about today, basically, so it started off as a talk about the role of, or the fate of communist parties in France and Italy after World War II. And I suppose it's kind of expanded and altered somewhat to be a bit of a longer take on the fate of Italian communist parties. And in addition, it's looking at the role of I suppose I suppose it's and the depth is a little bit patchy, with some areas being covered in a bit more depth than others. But in any case, I think it's an interesting introduction to two parties that have had a pretty enormous history and which don't normally feature part of, I suppose, what your average kind of person interested in politics in Ireland might learn about. So first of all, why are we looking at France and Italy? Well, I suppose basically France and Italy had the two largest communist parties after World War II in what would be known as kind of the developed capitalist economies. And they also emerged to that size out of significant roles in partisan movements. And so for that reason, I think it's interesting to look at them specifically as the ones who maybe came closest in the Western developed economies to taking electoral power, and also had the greatest depth of interest or of roots in the working class. So just to be clear throughout the presentation, obviously we're talking about the two communist parties, the Italian Communist Party and the French Communist Party. But in addition, obviously there's a whole range of other actors on the left. And broadly, I'm just going to call them by what they would be known in Ireland, which is generally Social Democrats. So in France, the Social Democratic Party, which is now known as the Socialist Party, had a number of previous names. In Italy, you have the Social Democrats and also the Christian Democrats, which can fit into that same broad frame of kind of emphasizing the importance of working across the working class and the capitalist class for tactical reasons. So just to kind of start, I suppose, before World War II and the background to these communist parties as they emerged in Western Europe. So I suppose the Second International grouping of socialist and labour parties, which was brought together in 1889, began to fall apart from 1915 to 1916, largely for two different reasons. Firstly, because of a different approach to World War I, with some supporting war credits, some advocating neutrality, and others advocating complete opposition to the war. And those differences, and secondly, a difference in approach to the October Revolution of 1917. And those differences played out within most parties who were members of the Second International, along with differences of position in relation to the October Revolution. And that included in France and Italy. The last formal meeting of the Second International took place in Geneva in July 1920. And in France, the French section of the Workers' International held a Congress in 1920 where a majority of its members voted to join the Comintern, which was set to replace the Second International for communists and went on to become known as the Third International. It was the Italian Communist Party similarly had a split in 1921 where the socialists and communists went their separate ways. And interestingly, the French Communist Party was actually the only communist organization in the world where the majority of the Second International Organization decided to follow the communist path. So rather than being, I suppose, as it's often perceived, a marginal split, which a marginalization of communists. In fact, in France, it was the clear majority of the workers' movement which decided to follow a communist route, with the socialists being in the minority and remaining within what was then called the workers' section of the French section of the Workers' International. So this. Both parties were banned in the period between 1920 and 1940, with the Communist Party of Italy quickly being banned in 1926, 4 years after the March on Rome, and the French International, or the French Communist Party, being banned in the lead up to World War II. So I suppose the crucial point is that the period of development between when they were formed as quite new initiatives in the early 1920s to the period where fascism took quite deep roots in both countries was very, very small. And I think that's important to bear in mind when we're talking about the kinds of growth that they saw during World War II and after World War II, and also the decisions and the breadth of options available to them in the immediate post-World War II period. So you had the founding of the Comintern in 1920. And I suppose there was a huge hope in the period after 1917, and the focus of the Comintern was on the very real possibility of world revolution, and that was very much what infused both the Italian Communist Party and the French Communist Party. But it gave way to a quick suppression of communist parties across many Western European countries. In Italy, for example, fascism was already swiftly rising with the 1922 March in Rome. And as I said, the Communist Party was banned by 1926. And these developments led to, I suppose, a fairly hardline period of the Communist International, giving way to the adoption of a popular front strategy in 1935. And again, you have this enormously quickly developing international context, which two parties relatively new are attempting to navigate. 1943 marked the end of the Comintern in favour of a nominally looser configuration, with individual country circumstances playing a greater role in setting the direction and agenda of the Communist Party's strategy and tactics. So that's kind of some of the background in terms of the international communist movement that the French Communist Party and the Italian Communist Party found themselves within in the early in the 1930s and early 1940s, in the decade after they were founded. So worldwide, Communist Party members outside of the Soviet Union grew enormously through World War II, from 1 million members outside the Soviet Union in 1935 to 14 million in 1945. Obviously, countries like China played an enormous part in this growth in numbers, but the growth in France and Italy was by far the most significant in terms of growth in Communist Party members in the developed capitalist economies. They became easily the two largest communist parties in the developed capitalist world. In Italy, the party grew from 5,000 members in 1943 to 2 million in 1945. And in France, it grew from 300,000 members in 1939 to 1 million in 1945. Now, obviously, when you look at the Communist Party figures there for 1943, a lot of that has to do with the ability to have registered members when an organisation is banned, things like the modernisation of party membership. But nonetheless, it demonstrates the absolutely enormous growth that both parties saw. And the single biggest factor in this was certainly the party's role in the partisan struggles. So in the partisan struggles. So just a bit of an overview of the ways in which both of those parties participated in the partisan movements in both countries during World War II. The French Communist Party certainly comes in for criticism for not beginning an active armed resistance until after 1941. And sometimes this is interpreted as kind of bowing down to Stalin, but it's a bit misleading. I suppose, firstly, considering the active appeasement of Hitler by the capitalist powers, by the Allies, until 1938, and also considering that no other left group in France began armed resistance before 1941 anyway. So it's a bit of a moot point. The Socialist Party eventually ended up actively collaborating in many ways with the Vichy regime, and yet it's often pointed out that somehow the Communist Party only failed to begin active resistance until 1941, solely because of Stalin and not at all because of other factors. And in reality, long before 1941, there was active and consistent opposition by both parties to the growth of fascism in other forms. So, for example, the French Communist Party publication L'Humanité was one of the first publications to denounce the Vichy regime for its anti-Semitism in its October 1940 edition. But from 1941 on, the French Communist Party formed what would become the most well-organised wing of the resistance movement. And it played a leading role alongside de Gaulle in the Conseil National de la Résistance, the CNR, or the National Council of the Resistance. By 1944 to 1945, the Communist Party was known in France as the party of 25,000 executed activists for the high toll its militants had paid for their role in the resistance. And in particular, I suppose, a turning point in terms of the French population's perception of the Communist parties in French society was in the liberation of Corsica in October 1943. That was seen as a critical turning point long before the Allied arrival in France of the battle against fascism within France, and it was very much led by communists. They were at all times semi-integrated into the main unified organs of the resistance, and that meant a fairly stable alliance with de Gaulle, who obviously was quite right-wing, very right-wing throughout that period. But de Gaulle, in turn, was forced to make fairly significant concessions to communism in his rhetoric because he recognised their crucial role in the resistance. In Italy, I suppose the question of the resistance, the scale of it, the nature of it was equally messy. And it really only began in 1943 after the flight of the king and after Mussolini was forced to resign. And the Italian Socialist Party joined forces with the Italian communists to form a resistance. The communists were the ones who were certainly far more numerous. And overall, from 43 to 45, 30,000 Italian partisans were killed fighting in the resistance. And Palmiro Togliatti, who was the leader of the Italian Communist Party, returned from exile in the USSR in March 1944. And on the 26th of April in 1945, both Milan and Genoa were taken by the communist-dominated partisans. So there's often quite a bit of debate about whether or not the partisans were actually the crucial part of the military victory in World War II. But that kind of misunderstands the objectives of the partisans. Certainly securing a victory over fascism was the dominating factor, in particular in their decision to set aside, I suppose, their own ideological objectives in favour of very, very broad alliances that went far beyond the breadth of the Popular Front before World War II. But equally, the partisan struggles were viewed as a way to regain national pride and national sovereignty. And this was really the tactical objective of the leaders of both the French Communist Party and the Italian Communist Party. They believed that without active participation in the armed struggle, the French and Italian populations and working class would not regain popular sovereignty, which had been lost through the occupation. And in this, they were particularly conscious of the role of the United States in the Allied forces war effort. So I'm just going to take a look at I'm going to take a look in a bit more detail at the development of the French and Italian Communist parties, in particular their electoral fates and electoral negotiations in the 10 years or so after World War II. But just to give you an idea of the overall, I suppose, the overall context in Europe, it was far from unusual the Communist Party saw a surge of support in Western Europe, even though it was significantly more obvious and more decisive in France and in Italy than many other countries. But here you just have an overview of the results in the first post-war election, which obviously varies from 45 to 49, of the communists. And you can see that in almost every country, it was a fairly significant result for them. In Italy, obviously in 46, you have 19% for the communists. In France, 26%, but equally in Finland, 23.5%. And a number of other countries reaching double figures. It's regarded as, I suppose, the high point of Western, the fate of communist organizations, electorally certainly, in the post-World War II era. So just to move to look at the role the electoral aftermath of World War II from the perspective of the communists in France. On the 21st of October 1945, the French voted to elect deputies to their first post-war government and to authorize them to author a new constitution. The three parties which had formed the resistance, together with de Gaulle, ran on a common programme of a welfare state, nationalisation of banks and industry, etc., in line with the demands of the resistance. So very much influenced by the politics of the Communist Party, which had in turn influenced the programme of the resistance. There were differences between these parties about the type of legislature which should take place, so the type of parliamentary regime, the type of electoral system. De Gaulle was very much pushing for a presidential system, whereas the communists and the socialists were looking for a more traditional parliamentary system, not so much emphasizing the importance of one individual president. And differences between this meant that the constitution which was put forward lost marginally. You can see the results here, by 53% against to 47% for. And during that referendum, it was very much used against the Communist Party that they were putting forward this unicameral system. They were putting forward, I suppose, rejecting the presidential model because they wanted to seize power in some sort of an undemocratic way. And during that referendum campaign in 1946, de Gaulle and the right-wing parties very much used accusations that if it was passed, Marxists would take control of private property, and private property would be abolished, that there would be a dictatorship by the assembly on behalf of the working class, and that very much influenced why it lost. So after a new assembly was re-elected in June 1946 to rerun the process of developing a constitution, and the Communist Party and Socialist Party slipped in support, and the revised constitution, which was significantly more right-wing, passed by a similarly narrow margin, but they did manage to get it across the line. However, when you look at it, the actual number of votes which it won was 9 million as opposed to 9.1 million in favour of the previous constitution, which the communists had favoured. So it really was a matter of turnout, something obviously we know lots about in Ireland with our referendum reruns. In any case, the de Gaulle favoured constitution won out and acquired enough support to bring the Fourth Republic into existence. So the beginnings of the French Fourth Republic and the exiling of communists by the Third Force Coalition. So November 1946 saw the first elections of the French Fourth Republic take place. The PCF won 28% of the vote and 182 seats. They got 5.5 million votes and became the largest party in the state. Significant factor in the significant increase in their vote. I think we have the, yeah, so you can see here there's a significant spike between early 1946 and later on. And that really takes place, the blue line is showing the popular vote. A large reason for this spike here over time is the increase in suffrage, which allowed women to vote. As a result of this election, this is a poster from the campaign, very much playing up the 46 to 47 campaigns, very much played up the French Communist Party's role in the resistance. The party of the resistance can become the great party of the French rebirth. So this is Maurice Thorez. He was the leader of the French Communist Party, and he's featured here on the cover of Time magazine in June 1946. As a result of the coalition, as a result of the November 1946 elections, the PCF became the largest party in the state. And off the back of that, Thorez demanded to lead the government which came out of the elections, but he was refused. And a new three-party alliance was formed, a third force coalition, which effectively lasted until 1958, an alliance between the Social Democrats, the centre-right, the Christian Democrats and the Liberals, which united around opposing both communism and what they called Gaullism. And this was, and effectively, and a very significant factor in this was the opposition, the pressure coming from the United States to on the French government to ensure the communists were excluded from government in order to secure martial aid. So just to look at that vote share again, one critical thing you can see happening here, as we said, after the 46 elections, when the French Communist Party became the critical, the largest party in the state, they retained a significant amount of the vote share, and their vote share drops off somewhat, but for a party that's effectively in opposition for almost 3 decades, it didn't drop off too much. But what you do see happen is that this what was called the Third Force Coalition until 58, it secured a vote on a new constitution, which changed the way that seats were elected. So here in 56, you can see that the Communist Party's vote dropped slightly from about 25% to about 21%. But in the same election, the percentage of the seats that it held dropped from about 25% of the seats to about 2%. And it recovers slightly because the Communist Party begins to go into coalitions and electoral coalitions with the other left forces. But you really do see that the crucial turning point in terms of the Communist Party's participation in the parliament comes with the new constitution ensuring that its popular support no longer translates into seats won. So what did they achieve in this period? So I suppose while in government and before exclusion from government, the PCF, it held 5 ministerial posts, nationalised coal, nationalised the Paris transport system. It nationalised 5 major banks, including the Banque de France and the Crédit Lyonnais. 34 major insurance companies were nationalised, and a number of companies accused of wartime collaboration, such as Renault, were also nationalised. Works councils were established in any workplace of 50 people or more, and the distinction between men and women for the purposes of setting wages was outlawed. Workers were given a voice in how state pension and social security funds were used. And in 1947, the picture we see here is of a strike taking place in Renault. At the time, there were about 30,000 workers in the Renault factory. 17,000 of them, so that's about 60%, were members of the Communist Party, not just voters or supporters, but full paid up members. A strike for better pay took place in 47, and it went against national pay agreements, and ultimately it led to the PCF's withdrawal from government, though in reality this was prompted by growing US pressure for the communists to leave government. And for the next decade, above a quarter of the electorate continued to vote communist. And as I said, the drop-off in this vote was in the late 50s, accompanied by an enormous drop in seats. From 72 to 83, the Communist Party decided to engage in a common programme with Mitterrand and with the Socialists, which really influenced the eventual policies of nationalisation. So I suppose quite significant left social democratic policies pursued by Mitterrand. But eventually he withdrew from those policies, and in 1983 Mitterrand ended the common programme with the communists. So there's a debate about that time in the wilderness, effectively from the mid-1940s, from about 47 to about 78, so almost 3 decades. The Communist Party was the largest left party in the state. And indeed, on numerous occasions, it was actually the outright largest party in the state. At all times over those 3 decades, it was a bigger party in terms of votes, in terms of members, than the Socialist Party. But never participated in government again until the late 1970s. There's a debate about, is this an enforced exile by the capitalist parties of the state, or is it as a result of some sort of Stalinist isolationist policy, is what the critics would call it. In turn, its turn towards electoral alliances in the 1950s is often interpreted as some form of a turn away from the politics of the Soviet Union and towards more openness. More likely, however, is that the turn towards alliance after 1958 was due to significant amendment to the electoral system that de Gaulle brought in, which saw the PCF's seat share drop so dramatically. It was kicked out of cabinet in 1947 rather than walking out, and a tripartite alliance was formed to ensure that the PCF, in spite of being the biggest party in the state, never led a government. It's hard to describe this as isolationism under directive from Moscow, and it's hardly accurate to describe an organisation with its scale as being in some way isolationist. Throughout that entire period, in spite of not participating in government, it managed to retain its membership into the millions, and it managed to obtain at least 20 to 25% of the vote share. So none of that points towards something isolationist, regardless of the number of ministers it did or didn't have. So to turn to the Communist Party of Italy for a couple of minutes. At the end of the war in Italy, from 1944 to 1947, the communists were also in government. The PCI, it served in a number of ministerial positions in the post-war provisional government up to 1947, and similar to in France, it was evicted from government in May 1947. On the 1st of May, 11 peasants were murdered by bandits in Sicily, and this allowed, I suppose similar to the Renault strikes, it allowed a sufficient crisis in the state to develop that gave cover to the reality of the communists as the most popular party in the state, as they were in France, and being removed from power. So the scale of the crisis, owing to the murder of 11 peasants in Sicily, led to the resignation of De Gasperi, the Prime Minister, the Christian Democrat Prime Minister at the time. The Prime Minister at the time, and he called elections in 1948, which for a new government. Again, for decades, really, there was discussion around whether or not this was kind of mandated by the United States. But since it's become quite clear, De Gasperi himself has made clear that both the US Secretary of State, George Marshall, and US Ambassador to Italy, James C. Dunn, made it clear to De Gasperi that Marshall aid was dependent upon him dissolving the coalition and removing the communists from government. Elections were called in 1948, and the most significant feature really was the level of US interventionism. And Paul Ginsberg, who wrote a fairly classic history of Italy in the 20th century and is by no means a communist sympathizer, said that US intervention in the 1948 Italian elections was breathtaking in its size, its ingenuity, and its flagrant contempt for any principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of another country. So they received $176 million in aid in the first 3 months of 1948 from the US government. But more important from the number than the amount of aid was the theatre that accompanied it. So the whole way through the election campaign in early 48, shipments of food, of medicine would arrive in ports across Italy, from Genoa to Naples, etc. And at every single arrival of aid, the US ambassador, James Dunn, would arrive and give a speech as the aid was arriving, talking about the role of America in the Italian recovery, talking about also the Christian Democrats and the excellent job that they were doing. And the speeches became more and more political as the campaign went on. And on the 20th of March 1948, George Marshall, the US Secretary of State, warned that all help to Italy would cease in the event of a communist victory. From America, Italian-American Hollywood stars were enlisted to record messages of support for the Christian Democrats, and the Catholic Church in America also played a significant role in backing up the Christian Democrats. So Cardinal Spellman, in the presence of Truman on the 17th of March, said, "1 month from tomorrow, Italy must make her choice of government. I cannot believe that the Italian people will choose Stalinism against God or Soviet Russia against America." And the Christian Democrats, in their propaganda coming up to the elections, really played up the fact that they were the American allies, that they were the party capable of sustaining this American aid, which had done so much to rehabilitate America, or Italy. One of their propaganda posters said, ads said, "All intelligent people will vote for De Gasperi," that's the leader of the Christian Democrats, "because he's obtained from America for free the flour for your spaghetti." And the Christian Democrats succeeded in this fear scare campaign. They won 48.5% of the vote, which in a country where a majority is almost unheard of is a pretty astonishingly good result. And while the Popular Front, which was the coalition between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, lost ground, the CPI, the Communist Party of Italy, actually increased its deputies from 106 to 140. So the Communist Party, in spite of all of these scare campaigns, did continue to grow. And it retained its share of the vote between 25% and 35% in every election through to the 1980s. So a couple of months after the election, the leader of the Italian Communist Party, Palmiro Togliatti, was shot. Because it came so quickly after an election where communists and Marxists were demonized, many Communist Party militants interpreted it as the beginning of an onslaught on the left, and they responded with what is a fairly spontaneous uprising across the country. In Genoa, the communists took clear power of the city over a couple of nights. In Turin, the Fiat factories were occupied and 15 hostages were held. And one PCI trade union member in Genoa said that evening Genoa was in the hands of the people, so much so that the police rang the ex-Partisans Association saying, "Send me a group of partisans to defend the police headquarters because I'm completely isolated here." And that insurrection was ended by the Communist Party leadership, who viewed it as impossible to sustain. And they felt that while there was very little in the way of while there was significant popular support for it in the cities where it took place, it would have been impossible to replicate across the rest of the country. So after 48, as I said, the PCI received between 25% and 35% of the vote in every election up to the 1980s. And by the mid-1960s, the US State Department estimated that the PCI still had 1.5 million members. The popular vote peaked at about 12 million for the Italian Communist Party, with 35% of the vote in the mid-1970s. And again, similar to the French Communist Party, despite, I suppose, its exclusion from government, it's very hard to depict that as an isolationist strategy when there's that scale of depth in the party. So just to talk a little bit beyond elections, the life and the culture within the PCI and the PCF, the French Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party, after World War II. So one critical element of the, sorry, I'll just get my notes back to the right place. One critical element of the, characteristic of the parties that emerged out of the World War II, and one that was kind of a double-edged sword, was the growth in peasant support and rural support for both parties. In both Italy and France, one of the major changes in the composition of the parties was this growth. So this is an image by Guttuso, who was a Communist Party artist who actually designed the logo for the Italian Communist Party. And it shows a group of peasants occupying uncultivated land. It was something that was quite common in rural areas in the 1950s, the late 1940s and the early 1950s in Italy. And you can see peasants carrying the red flag as they occupy the land. For example, in Tuscany, one of the heartlands of the resistance, a growing Communist Party stronghold, in the 1950s, much of Tuscany was still about 90% under a sharecropping system called the mezzadria. And so in Siena, for example, it was up to 90%. And the peasants became organised around demands for tenure security and for the right to unionisation and welfare entitlements, effectively a normalisation as workers. And the communists became leaders in kind of politicising this struggle, and attempted to do so in a somewhat modern way. So trying to push peasants towards calls for unionisation, towards rights in the welfare system, as opposed to towards small-scale agriculture and land ownership. The Communist Party coordinated the withholding of crops in 1945 and helped to organise a campaign for housing rights, largely focused on the right of families to live without animals in their home place. And in 1951, the Tuscan sharecroppers that the Communist Party was organised an enormous protest against the visit of Dwight Eisenhower to Tuscany in 1951. And I suppose in some ways linked to that, you have a second characteristic of the parties, which is that they developed a somewhat national tinge or patriotic tinge throughout the World War period that they carried into the post-war period. And in large part, this resulted from their association in the partisan movement. And it was also tactically chosen by the leadership of both parties to deepen their roots within the working class in the countries. So the Italian Communist Party's constitution, for example, required the Italian national anthem to be sung after national meetings, along with the Internazionale and the Bandiera Rossa. And the national flag was regularly flown alongside the red flag. And with this, in Italy in particular, you saw in order to, I suppose, adopt this image as the national party, the party of the people, there were also significant compromises made to social conservatism in some ways. And you have here this classic image of the Communist Party office alongside the icon of the Sacred Heart, which I think shows up in an awful lot of places, but isn't an realistic depiction of Italian communism in the period. And this also played out in a lot of its dealings with the Christian Democrats. But when you look at that national tinge, which certainly was there, that patriotic element within the Italian Communist Party, the French Communist Party, you see this strange contradiction in the criticisms that are levelled at the two parties by those in the ultra-left. On the one hand, they're accused of being sort of USSR plants, subservient to a foreign country, prioritising an alliance with the USSR above their own working class, and that they refused to adopt a locally appropriate strategy, that everything was just being driven by Moscow the whole time. And then on the other hand, they're accused of not being sufficiently internationalist and are kind of condemned for having taken on this patriotic element. Or not becoming socially progressive fast enough. And there might be merit to both of these criticisms, but it's not really accurate to dismiss what the parties were doing for that. I don't think it's really possible to be a party of 5 million voters without having a culture that's broadly understandable by the masses of the working class. So just to describe them as kind of insular it's just not convincing. And one really interesting component of this kind of patriotic turn and what the communists in Italy managed to do with it was the anti-war movement that emerged amongst the sharecroppers in Tuscany in the 1950s. You saw, as I said, there was demonstrations in very rural and remote villages. You have to remember these are villages where, like I said, 90% of the people working the land are sharecroppers, where the vast majority of lodgings, families are still sharing their sleeping accommodation with animals and so on, and very convincing and educated protests against in particular the growth of NATO, the establishment of NATO bases in near to the Tuscan coast started to be seen. So in one example, for example, in Montalcino, 8,000 sharecroppers signed a demand to that from their comune to ban nuclear weapons after the 1952 nuclear tests in the island of Bikini. And these people became known as the peace partisans. And famously, right across Tuscany, you started to see peace flags being flown from haystacks that the sharecroppers were using as a form of protest against their country's increasing alliance with NATO. This is an example of one of the flags here. You can see it's a whole load of, it's kind of like a collage, and often this was because all that the countries had, or all of the people had, were little scraps of fabric that they sewed together. And the pace word here in the middle, and it's often seen as kind of the precursor of what we now know as the peace flag. So the third factor I think that's of interest is the scale of popular support. It's very hard to quantify this, but one good illustration is the Case del Popolo, or the People's Houses, which had been established before World War II by the Communist Party. I couldn't find a number of them, but to give you an idea, today, even though the PCI has completely declined, you have about 5,000 of them still in existence across the country, and some 1 million members of what's now known as Archie, the kind of the successor to the Case del Popolo. And what I think is really interesting about them is that, so in the top left-hand corner, you have a Case del Popolo in, I think, Bandia is the name of the town in Emilia-Romagna. And these were established. They were then taken over by the fascists. So in the bottom left-hand corner there, it says Questo edificio è del popolo, which means this building belongs to the people. And it would have been, this writing would have been written up in protest to the fact that the fascists had taken it over and turned it into a Casa del Fascisto, or a fascist house. And then, and after the word Badia, it was after the war, these were gradually rebuilt in some places into new people's houses, but in many instances they were actually co-opted by the Christian Democrats and nationalized, but in effect controlled by the Christian Democrats who held electoral power. So what I think this really shows is that rather than just closing down the communist institutions and the cultural institutions around the country, really both the fascists and the Christian Democrats were forced to co-opt these institutions and to take them over as their own. That's how deep the roots of it were. It really reminds you of the way Catholicism had to kind of take over the pagan roots in Ireland in order to take hold. And I suppose one last thing to mention, actually it doesn't really matter, sorry, the time's kind of going on. One last thing to mention actually is, I suppose, the different approaches to the party form might have been generally the kind of the standard interpretation is that Togliatti on the right here is was the kind of the one who was willing to make the compromises, to turn away from, the Leninist party of discipline and centralism and towards a broader kind of institution. And on the left-hand side, Torres, the leader of the French Communist Party, is often depicted as kind of a hardliner. But what I think is really interesting is that in both cases, after 68, when the cultural revolutions and the students' revolutions took place, both of them became both parties were demonized as dinosaurs. So the fact that Togliatti took this turn towards a more liberal party didn't save the Italian Communist Party from being demonized as, opposing modernity, opposing the students' rebellions of the 1960s. Okay. So so just to kind of look at what's the verdict? Like, what do we kind of think? Was it on the face of it, what we see are parties whose success soared in the mid-1940s and who were unable to consolidate on this for several decades. Enormous electoral gains, growth in trade unions, millions of members and even more voters had a decisive impact on forcing the social democratic forces to the left and growing class consciousness. But all the time they remained embedded in the liberal democratic order. So was it a wasted opportunity? Was there an opportunity to move further? Did the two parties in Italy and France refuse to complete a people's revolution? Did they capitulate to liberal democratic parties? Were they following Stalin's orders in doing this? Did the Soviet Union refuse to provide military support? I think a really good way of, sorry, this is not actually the quote that I wanted, unfortunately, I'll have to read it. I think a really good quote by Togliatti in 1960 speaks to the reality of this view. often the criticism is that those parties refused to kind of seize the possibility for revolution between 1945 and 48. And what Togliatti said was, certainly an insurrectionary attack and its inevitable defeat, either in 46 or 48, would have suited some comrades well. No danger of the bureaucratization of the party in that case, and the so-called revolutionary cadres could have gone off happily to schools of tactics and strategy in prison or in exile. So his view in 1960 was that, you know, there were always these kinds of adventurous revolutionaries who felt that the PCI, and the same can be applied to the PCF, didn't push far enough for whatever reason. They were opportunists, they were Stalinists, they didn't push far enough. And his view, and I think it's quite clear that he's correct, is that if they had pushed further, they would have ended up, as he says, in exile or in prison. And, you know, this isn't much good to the working class. And if you look at the balance of forces and the way that the next decade played out, and in particular the tendency of the lengths that the United States was willing to go to prevent communism from taking hold in Europe, I think you get a sense of just how far they would have gone had the communists attempted to make a revolution. So looking at Greece, many people will point to Greece and say, well, the Greeks attempted to fulfill their revolution, and certainly, you know, there's a certain moral victory that would have been won from the Italians holding Genoa in 1948, for example. But when you look at how it turned out, you know, as soon as it seemed in Greece that the communists were winning, the UK and US stepped in to defeat the communists. And in 49, after their defeat, the Communist Party was again outlawed. The future leaders of the Greek junta began to immediately receive $1 million a year in CIA funding. A weak liberal democracy lasted barely a decade before a military junta came into force. I think it's a fair reasoning that had the Italian Communist Party or the French Communist Party attempted to push further in the mid-1940s, that there's a very real possibility that a similar situation could have developed there. And, you know, it's set against a backdrop where you have Marshall aid to the tune of $1.2 billion for Italy over the course of the Marshall Aid Plan, and $2.2 billion for France, streaming in to suppress communists. And that's when the communists weren't in government. Marshall making it quite clear that the purpose of the aid was to ensure free institutions in those countries. And perhaps most notably and most obviously, but maybe the least well known of the factors limiting the ability of communists to grow in the period, was the stay-bound operations operated by the CIA in France and in Italy, known by the name Operation Gladio. So a decision was taken by NATO's predecessors to establish stay-behind cells in Western European countries, which could be activated in the case of a communist uprising. They were directed and funded by the CIA. And in Italy, when the plot came to light in the 1990s, the Italian government announced it had located 167 weapons dumps across the countries, which had been under the control of covert cells. The Washington Post, when the plot came to light in the 1940s, said that one network included at least 2 former Nazi SS members, and one was run by a former German army officer referred to by the CIA as an unreconstructed Nazi. So it's quite well established, the Washington Post, again, not being the most overt communist amongst us, it's quite well established that the Nazis and SS members were recruited by the CIA and trained in Sardinia to carry out covert anti-communist operations right across Western Europe, with a particular focus on Italy and France. When you look at the balance of forces at play post-World War II, where the Soviet Union had lost 15% of its population, its GDP fell 35% from 1940 to 1942. And by contrast, the US unemployment rate fell, its currency became the reserve currency of the world, its economic growth shot up, and its infrastructure was untouched by war. The ability to expand the communist revolution, the fact of there being militancy in Genoa, it pales in significance to the global events that were taking place, and the global opposition to communism, which was being orchestrated and organized by the United States. In 1947, by the time, so were the PCF and the PCI prioritizing their alliance with the USSR in deciding to hold back from revolution? Maybe they were, and maybe they weren't. But it's flawed to assume that prioritizing an alliance is always a matter of subservience and not just good tactics. What hope would the revolutions have had without an alliance with the USSR in the face of US anti-communism? And would it have been right for Togliatti to allow the communists to seize Turin or Milan or Genoa, and to continue in the knowledge of the scale of US opposition that was likely to face the communists afterwards? So Hobsbawm, when he was writing about the history of the French Communist Party in 1964, said, "The history of communism in the developed economies of the West has been the history of revolutionary parties in countries without revolutionary prospects." But beyond not having insurrectionary prospects, it's the histories of parties that really never had any time to breathe. The move from a basic struggle for suffrage that strengthened the communist hand was swiftly followed by a world war. That in turn was swiftly followed by a plunge into fascism, carnage, and then the newly dominant United States turning all of its might towards ensuring that communism did not break through in Western Europe. And all of this was taking place barely 20 years after these parties had formed. And I think the lesson to be learned from it all is that doctrine and ideology are only one small part of the puzzle. Our tactics and our resources, the strength of our enemies, and ultimately the hand that history deals us have huge roles to play, and must be important parts of assessing the successes or failures or rights or wrongs of any political movement, as much as the morals of it. Okay, I will leave it at that. That was much longer than I expected, so I'm very sorry. But I will now unmute everybody.